Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Everyone is joining right now, so we'll get started in a couple minutes. I'm going to go ahead and put a link to the shared notes if you're interested. One sec. That was not them. Still joining. Let's give it a minute or two more. Mhm. We'll start in 1 minute. Okay, I know we still have people jumping into the session here, but I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Thank you so much for joining us today, and welcome to the 5th session of the CLIR Climate Resiliency Action Series. I'm Alice Rubin, and I'm the CLIR Program Officer for Strategic Initiatives. Today, we have a panel of 4 speakers joining us to talk about place-based planning. We're thrilled to have everyone here, and I'm going to allow the moderator for our session, Jennifer Waxman, to do those introductions. Prior to that, I am sharing with everyone where we are in the webinar series and its purpose. For all of our sessions, you're welcome to participate in the note taking and can place your name on it if you would like, but you're not required to. These notes will be archived along with video recordings of each session. Again, here are the notes. I'm going to put it in the chat. All right. And also, just as a reminder, video recordings of previous sessions can be found on the program website and on the resource page, and also on the CLIR DLF YouTube page. And here are links for both of those. Jennifer, can you get me to the next slide? Our series includes 6 thematic sessions, and this is the 5th, with one more taking place on April 9th. We also have a community-led climate circle, which is a more informal discussion. The 5th climate circle for today's session will take place on March 21st at 1 p.m. EST. We'll share information about that towards the end of the session. Those talks are led by DLF Climate Justice Working Group co-chairs Justin Wadlin and Lisa Spiro. We will also have some in-person networking events at various conferences, and we'll share more about that once that information is made public. We'll also be building a community toolkit from the session findings, which will be free and available and archived for everyone to use as they see fit. As a reminder, Jennifer, if you can go to the next slide. Yep. Thank you. Here is our calendar to show you where we are and where we're going. After the session, we'll be reconvening in April to discuss big data and the preservation problem. This panel addresses the conflicts and opportunities between climate issues and digital archives, including maintaining industry standards such as those from NDSA that encourage multiple geographically distributed copies. If you can go to the next slide. Time for thanks. Thank you to our sponsors, the IMLS National Leadership Grant, which has provided us with funding for these sessions, and generous support from CLIR, my organization, particularly from Wayne Graham, our CIO. We also have an advisory committee made up of the DLF Climate Justice Working Group members who have helped us put this together, namely Lisa and Justin, as well as Amy Dreer and Lena Zentel, who were part of that. We also had a curriculum committee who helped us come up with excellent topics for the 6 sessions. That includes Jennifer Waxman, who you'll be hearing from today, Jennifer Embry, Jody Gray, Trevor Bond, and Steve Diggs. Thank you so much to those people for allowing us to share this knowledge and move us forward in this conversation. Now I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jennifer.
Hello, everybody. I just want to make sure everyone can hear me. Yes. Okay. Thank you all for joining us today. I would like to thank CLIR for their partnership and support on this grant, as well as the advisory committee made up of the DLF Climate Justice Working Group members for bringing this grant into being. I am on the curriculum committee, as you heard, for this series, and though I've been an archivist for 15 years working in the cultural heritage sector, the idea for this workshop came from my training and experience in emergency management and disaster response. My goal in organizing this panel was to bring us together to use tools and grounding ideas to aid our work in building climate resilience on a hyper-local level for memory workers and people working for collecting organizations. Our question today is, how do we think about climate change on a hyperlocal scale in the cultural heritage sector? How has a complex issue like climate change challenged our understanding of the disaster management cycle, which previously supported mitigation of risk, preparedness, and response to a singular or episodic disaster, not months and years of change and unpredictability that is climate change? First, I'd like to address a common misconception. As I said in my introduction to resilience in the first workshop of this series back in September of last year, I am not cheerleading you into resilience or asking you to bounce back and get over it, or to return to the status quo in the face of a disaster, like an elected official after a crisis. We are not employing a literal definition of resilience here, where something returns to its original shape after a disturbance, like a spring or a rubber band. An important distinction to make here is that resilience in this context is not an outcome, it is a process. So the definition and concept of resilience that I refer to with terms like climate resilience and community resilience originates from ecologists studying ecosystems in the late 20th century. You can see on this slide the definition of climate resilience. It's pretty complicated. I'll give you a minute to look over it. Embedded in the core of the concept, whether it's about an ecosystem or a socio-ecological system, is the interconnectedness of a diversity of species communities, and subcultures operating as systems within systems where each are responding to and adapting to each other and the forces of change around them. Those forces can be small or major, and disruptions allowing living systems to reorganize and transform, which provides a chance for new growth and for the system or species to persist. Your participation in this session today is actively growing resilience within the cultural heritage sector through the formation of connections, through the germination of ideas, by making space for a diversity of expertise and disciplines, and growing and transforming as we engage with each other. These connections can help us manage the overwhelmingness of climate change and the complexity and uncertainties around it. Now, before I go further, I wanted to share parts of the land acknowledgement written by the Indigenous faculty and the staff affinity group at Tulane, and I'm dropping that into the chat for everybody. The Choctaw, Homa, Chitimacha, Biloxi, and other Native peoples have lived on this land since time immemorial. Their identities are inextricably connected to this place. With gratitude and honor, let's pay tribute to the original inhabitants of this land. The city of New Orleans was not built upon virgin soil, but merely served as a continuation of a great indigenous trade hub known in Choctaw as Bulbancha, or the place of other tongues. For thousands of years, people lived along the Mississippi River, and Bulbancha served as a place for diverse cultures to come together. Now, back to my own words, though our session today comes from a Western Eurocentric approach that uses inquiry, critical thinking, and scientific reasoning to problem solve, there are other ways of knowing about place, such as indigenous knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge, the values of which incorporate teachings that come directly from the land and deeply value one's relationship to it. I ask that as you engage in place-based understanding today, whatever your approach, to consider throughout this session how you have come to know the land that you inhabit and to honor and value your relationship to it. Sorry. Now our panelists today, Era Tanzi, Alessandra Girolamo, Dan Hackborn, will address an aspect of how to approach our current situation on a hyperlocal level with a focus on interconnection and with adaptation and transformation in mind. Era will share knowledge of data and tools that determine climate risk exposure within a specific ecoregion. Alessandra will provide insight into universal needs of communities that can advance planning regardless of the politics at play in your environment. And Dan will discuss climate librarianship through a framework he developed to advance social cohesion at scale. Okay, thank you for listening. I will stop sharing my screen and turn this over to Era, who is our first speaker.
All right. Can someone confirm that they are seeing my slides and not my Zoom background? All right, great. Thank you, everyone. Well, I'm going to show some tools that you can use for understanding climate change impacts to where you live or where you work. And normally I do not like to do presentations with a bunch of caveats and disclaimers at the beginning because I think that detracts from the message, but these are not normal times. And so I feel like I have to provide a little bit of background for what is happening right now with the rapidly changing data landscape. So historically, the United States has had some of the best open data in the world for understanding climate change science, as well as its impacts to our lives, our cultures, and our livelihoods. And those major data sources have historically included several of the agencies you see here. There are also several agencies that are in the news on a very regular basis right now because there are a lot of unknown changes coming to them. There have also already been cutbacks and pretty serious shifts in policy coming from these agencies. So things are changing very fast with a lot of our federal climate data tools. But one thing I want to stress as of today, and of course this could all change next week, but as of today, a lot of these tools are still online. I think there is a little bit of a not totally accurate sense that it's all gone away. That is not the case. However, because things are changing so fast, that is why it is all the more imperative for those of you who have thought about trying to look at what's out there for climate change impacts to where you live or work. Don't delay on using these tools while they are still here. Because although there are some groups that are trying to reconstruct things, those reconstructed tools often lose functionality in the process as well. So that's something we could talk more about during Q&A. But with this, I think we are going to see greater reliance in the future on local, state, non-governmental organization, and corporate provided sources of climate change data. And although, because I am an American, I work in America, most of my teaching, most of my clients are Americans, the tools I teach are very US centric. So I apologize in advance to those of you who are not based in the United States. That said, because the United States has historically been such a leader in terms of climate change data and science, this has international implications. So for example, a lot of what we know about atmospheric science comes from NASA, because NASA has satellites that are tracking things with the atmosphere. And that's the data that also other countries use, international bodies use. So as much as it might be tempting to think that this is a problem contained to the United States, it is not. It has international implications. So in terms of keeping track of what's going on with federal policy, I'm not going to go deep into this, but on the left-hand side of the screen, these are some very good environmental journalism resources for a general audience. So these are the sources that are often breaking news about, hey, these new changes are happening at EPA. Those targeted sources like Inside Climate News are often breaking those stories before they appear in organizations like NPR, the New York Times. So I strongly recommend that. The Guardian is also a very good source of climate news because they don't take funding from the oil and gas industry. So that is why of all the mainstream news desks, the Guardian is the one that I personally trust the most in terms of environmental coverage. For those of you who have a better understanding of administrative law, regulations, and rulemaking, the two trackers I have on the right-hand side of the screen from Columbia Law School and Harvard Law School are doing a very good job at tracking on a literal day-by-day basis what is happening in terms of rollbacks for federal policy. So these are my kind of disclaimers about where we are today, how to keep track of what's going forward, but know that things are changing very fast. So let's take a look at 3 of these tools. And you will notice if you look at the URLs for these, and by the way, I know that we're making all the slides available, so don't feel like you have to write down these long URLs. They will be in the slide deck that it's provided. Notice that the one in the middle is the one that has a .gov URL, which means that theoretically it is potentially the most vulnerable. The other 2 tools are hosted outside of the federal government. However, again, because climate data in the United States historically has often been provided by federal agencies, they rely on data where some things are starting to happen where sources that used to be prominently available are now in some cases becoming obscured. And I will show you a very clear example of that in the coming slides. If you want to find other tools, there are a lot of state and local governments that have put together similar climate visualization tools. So I have seen this for states like Massachusetts and California. Some very forward-thinking cities have also done this. The city of New York has a lot of local climate data visualization tools. So you can always try doing an internet search to find additional tools to what I have here. This is just a little bit of a sample to give you a sense of what kind of tools are out there. So let's start with the first one, which is the climate mapping for resilience and adaptation assessment. By the way, I always teach tools like this when I'm in a big audience with screenshots, because I never know if I try to do a live demo, that will inevitably be when things are offline, sometimes just for maintenance reasons, not necessarily for sinister reasons. So you are seeing screenshots, but I have double checked to make sure that all these screenshots still reflect what you would do if you did this on your own today. So the first example we're going to look at is Kings County, New York. This is Brooklyn. And what I want to draw your attention to is the language in the middle of the screen where it says lower and higher emissions. This is something you often see in climate change planning spaces, because we do not necessarily have a crystal ball of what fossil fuel emissions are going to look like over the next century. So if we manage to meet some of these ambitious goals, like, for example, reaching net zero by 2040, that would be a lower emission scenario. However, if we do what I would call the drill baby drill scenario, that is the higher emission scenario. So we don't know where we're going to end up with on that spectrum. And also, this is talking about internationally, right? Because the United States climate fossil fuel emissions don't just stay contained to us. This is talking about the international sphere. So in these different scenarios, that is what we're looking at when we are talking about what will climate change impacts look like in the next 20 years, the next 60 years, or by the end of this century. And if you take a look on the right-hand side, you will notice that there's the early century, so this is basically through the next 20 years. The differences between a lower and a higher emission scenario is not that appreciable, right? We know that in either scenario, we're probably going to have, 20-something days where it is above a maximum temperature of 90 degrees Fahrenheit. However, if we look at the end of the century, we can see that the difference between a lower emission scenario and a higher emission scenario is a huge, huge difference, right? This is why climate change science people are constantly saying every single small, it might seem insignificant, but every tiny hundredth of a degree of warming we can prevent now will have exponential effects in the future. So that's what this is illustrating in the lower right-hand corner. Now I want to show you about something that has changed with this tool, reflecting some of the federal changes. So I'm going to change a couple slides here between screenshots, and I want you to pay attention to the upper right-hand part of this where it says building code, lower resistance. Now keep an eye on this, and I will show you, we're going to take a time machine back to 6 months ago when I last taught this tool. So this is an old screenshot of what this tool looked like when I taught this about 6 months ago. And you will notice that there's now something up there that says 58.7% of population in disadvantaged communities. That data is coming from a tool that has been taken offline called the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool. Now, the good news is that somehow you can still get this data through this website currently, but it's not totally obvious. So let's go back to the current view. And if you were to click on where it says Get Complete Report, then you can see over on the left-hand side of the screen, that same number, 58% population disadvantage, is still there. But again, that data is not live, so I'm not totally sure if this report is pulling it from an archive data set somewhere, what's going on here. I don't have that level of insight. So this is just to show you that even though some of this data is, weird things are happening to it, sometimes it's just obscured, right? So, but that also brings in implications for what is happening in the future. It's great if we have an archive data set, but if we aren't updating it in the future, then that prevents some of our future understanding of these impacts. So let's go on to tool number 2. This is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration Sea Level Rise Viewer. I've picked Fort Lauderdale because I have family members near there, so this is useful for those of you who live in coastal parts of the United States. What this shows you is it's a slider tool where you can understand the impacts of sea level rise over a certain period. Now, it doesn't necessarily tell you, here's the current predictions for how much we are going to have sea level rise by this certain time period, because again, a lot of that depends on the lower or higher emission scenarios. But you can use this tool on the left to visualize if we had 1 foot of sea level rise, this is what it would look like. If we had 3 feet of sea level rise, this is what it would look like. And if we had 6 feet, obviously that is of deep concern for folks in South Florida. The green and the blue on this map have slightly different meanings, but basically it means that the more green and the more blue you see here, the more that we are talking about areas that would be inundated in a sea level rise scenario. Okay, let's look at the last tool. This comes to us, this climate resilience resources for cultural heritage. You might note that a tool developed for cultural heritage is coming from a cultural heritage organization. This was developed by the American Institute for Conservation, which is the professional association for conservation and preservation professionals. As a full disclosure, I was on the advisory board for developing this tool. This tool brings in a lot of different data sources. So it brings in some of the federal data we have, but it's also bringing in some of these newer data analytics tools that especially the insurance industry is starting to rely on. So, I think in the before times, there was a part of me that thought, well, is this just replicating what we already have in federal sources? And now I see how useful it is to have these tools that aren't totally reliant on a federal platform. So a couple things I want to point out about this is that what it shows you on the left-hand side are all of these different risks. It kind of tells you what are the highest risks for this particular area. By the way, the address I put in here is the National Archives that's down the street from the White House. So you can see that there's a high risk of flooding. But you will notice also that, again, there's something a little bit twitchy with this data, which is that if you know anything about Washington, D.C., you know that it's not a 0% disadvantaged city. So that square in the middle of the screen where it says 0% disadvantage, again, that is pulling from that data tool, the climate and economic justice screening tool we saw in that first tool. And because that is no longer a live data set, and apparently there is not an archive data set on the back end, it means that we do have to take that particular part of it with a grain of salt, because that is trying to reference a data set which is no longer available. That's why it's saying 0%. So again, this is all to say that things are changing very fast. And I think what I want to say with my remaining minute here is that if you have thought about using any of these tools, you should still use them. I'm not seeing anything that's like, oh, this is blatantly lying to me, right? I don't think we have to worry, at least right now, of existing data sets basically having inaccurate information on them, but we need to be smart information professionals and understand how these tools are using underlying sources of data. And what I would encourage you to do is to use all of these tools and save your work, because especially with things like the Sea Level Rise Viewer, which is a direct NOAA.gov tool, we just can't predict the future, and we don't know what's going to happen with this. Some of these tools might be online for the next several years because they're kind of floating around on obscurity. Some of them, like that climate and economic justice screening tool, that went offline a month ago. So things are changing fast, but I'll go ahead and wrap up here. And I know we will probably have a lot of questions later on that I'd be happy to answer. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Era. I also apologize. I neglected to read your bio prior to your presentation. I have dropped the link to your bio from the CLIR Climate Action Series contributors webpage in the chat for those who would like to check it out. And I encourage you to. Our next speaker is Alessandra Girolamo. She is the director for the Center of Environment, Land, and Law at Loyola University College, at Loyola University New Orleans College of Law. She previously served as associate professor and director of the doctoral program in emergency management at Jacksonville State University. Dr. Girolamo was also previously the climate justice lead at the U.S. Geological Survey's National Climate Adaptation Science Center. She's a community resilience specialist and applied researcher at the Lowland Center with expertise in disaster recovery, risk reduction, and hazard policy. She has published several books and articles, including Disaster Recovery Through the Lens of Justice, the relationship between persons and property, implications for climate change and resettlement, and justice, equity, and emergency management. Alessandra, would you like to share your screen?
Thank you. You just get the slides up. Right. Hopefully everybody can see my slides. What I'm going to talk about is sort of zooming in at what I consider the hyper-local, small communities of place, informal networks. A lot of my work is in coastal Louisiana, but I'll draw examples from a few other places as well. And I want to start just by noting that at that really hyper-local scale, the notion of disasters as discrete events, it's sort of absurd. It doesn't quite work, right? Most people, communities, organizations are really dealing with a combination of factors that include things like the economy, slow onset events, climate, but also just changes over time that they're seeing in their communities, impacts to culture and heritage. And and despite all of that, the desire for resilience is universal. It's just not always framed in those terms. A lot of people talk about resilience as a buzzword. When I started doing this work 20 years ago, it was much harder to say climate than it is now, even though it still can be. But people were very open and very willing to talk about change, to talk about protecting themselves, their heritage, their families, their ways of life. And so there's something here that I think is very universal. So what I'll talk about, I want to talk a little bit about this idea of lowercase p planning, so not sort of planning with a capital P, mutual aid and networks of care, a little bit about horizontal networks, sort of connecting those networks, and then a little bit about how to engage. And so first, lower P planning. And this is a picture from a visit that I and several community leaders were fortunate enough to be able to take to the Segreyate Land Trust. And this is something that I'll talk about in a little bit, these sort of very place-based, but also land-based efforts at protecting lifeways and heritage. And some of you may already be engaged in this kind of planning. And so now that I've sort of proposed that there's a little bit of a difference between the capital P planning and the lowercase p, let me just say for a minute who the sort of planners are in the more formal sense, right? They're often folks that are in government agencies, in NGOs, professionals, folks with a lot of letters after their name, right? But a lot of planning goes on in the day-to-day. So on the one hand, we have emergency management, state agencies, regional planning commissions, developing things like climate adaptation plans, hazard mitigation plans, comprehensive economic development plans, recovery plans. And those can all be resources at the hyperlocal, but sometimes they're not a match. So if we don't have that relationship back and forth, the utility of that at the local level can be kind of called into question. And so the more local planners think about community groups, think about culture brokers and community leaders, emergent organizations, advocacy groups, others who hold knowledge. We all plan in different ways. And because I mentioned knowledge, but I wanted to take a minute to actually address knowledges. Jennifer in the intro sort of talked about the framing that we have, at again, the local level, folks who aren't credentialed and have degrees in planning, right? They're thinking not just about formal knowledge, but also explicit and tacit knowledge, traditional ecologic knowledge, different kinds of informal knowledges. We have citizen scientists, we have a lot of activists, we have knowledge of history and context. All of these pieces come together. Knowledge of policy systems and policy change, knowledge of data, that's also very important. But how these all can weave together is how we can really promote resilience in the most effective and beneficial way. Another component here is that heritage includes knowledge. We have in many communities lost adaptive capacity over time, right? As the environment has changed, as ways of living have changed, lifeways, interconnectivity, social capital. And so sometimes what we're thinking isn't looking forward to the next thing, the next tools, the next resources. It's actually how we look back. And that's something that the sort of smaller scale local planning can very much contribute. And then I wanted to talk about the ways in which people engage with these processes. In a more formalized planning process, often people engage as stakeholders or individuals. Maybe they're a community representative or an organizational representative. Sometimes they can be leaders or co-leaders, but that's much less common. And sometimes they can also be in opposition, right? calling into question the worldviews that are being put forward by these plans. Particularly when these plans, again, retain this sort of distinction where thinking about the economy sits over here, thinking about health sits over here, thinking about heritage sits over here, thinking about children over here, floods are here, but tornadoes are here, right? That's a little artificial for what people experience. Planning processes can lowercase p at the local level. People engage as leaders, as drivers, as creators. They engage as imaginers. They engage as storytellers. They engage as custodians. These are very different types of engagement. Now, I wanted to talk for a moment about this notion of mutual aid and also networks of care. A lot of this very hyper place-based work occurs in different types of networks that are often hyper local. And again, a lot of you, I'm sure, participate in different networks, including communities of practice, right? Including your own neighborhoods. And these are networks that actually operate in many ways, regardless of political affinity, right? Regardless of how people feel about these sort of broader questions, we all tend to come together around needs. And so I just wanted to give a little context because I'm here in New Orleans. I always like to share that the first recorded mutual aid association in the US, and this is formally recorded, of course, is in 1783. And that's the Perseverance Benevolent and Mutual Aid Association. And we saw across the country a huge rise in mutual aid organizations as a response to what were considered failures of government issues around racism, social upheaval, and we've seen a resurgence lately of mutual aid around disasters. And what is mutual aid? It's very rooted in community. It's a means of bringing people together, identifying resources, identifying gaps, and it builds community ties, it builds community, and it then can often interact with government and these larger systems, but it's not guaranteed to do so. And I think it's very important not just to sort of hold up this idea of the hyperlocal as really sort of absolving, right, other partners at a larger scale from also being part of this. One quick example to share, after Hurricane Zeta, a local mutual aid network here in New Orleans immediately put up this map showing where folks were giving others access to community power. And so literally, you know, being able to charge your phone, those kinds of things. And because that came up, government did end up engaging, right? And actually libraries were added, fire stations, community centers were all added to this map as spaces where somebody could go and get access to power, which is really important for applying for assistance, right? It's important for so many different things. And then another example from New Orleans is the First Peoples Conservation Council. They're a consortium of 6-member tribes along the Louisiana coast that have been working together. 2012 is when they sort of formally organized, but actually these networks predate that by a long time. And just to give an idea of the kinds of things that they look at and focus on, things like disaster risk reduction, healthy food access, preservation of lifeways and culture, how to increase access and voice for their members. And what has that looked like? It has looked like gathering oral history, land rematriation efforts. We actually had a successful land rematriation of a few acres to the Grand Bayou Indian Village very recently, which included a historic mound. Co-authoring publications, working with data scientists in spaces like the National Center for Atmospheric Research to actually look at downscaling and identify where the large data sets couldn't really account for what local knowledge, you know, held, particularly in the coastal systems. This is a picture from the canals work where the tribes have been able to work together with larger partners to do things like backfill canals. That's one of the reasons we have coastal erosion, is these legacy oil and gas canals in Louisiana, and also strengthen banks with things like oyster shells. And they've also done some really cool things with things like mushrooms in the past. But all of this being focused not just on restoration of the coast, but actually cultural resilience and protecting sacred sites. And then I wanted to talk for a moment about these sort of horizontal networks. I mentioned that these sort of local networks are connected to each other in different ways. And one really good example of this is the Rising Voices Network, which up until this administration was housed at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. And it brought together folks from tribal and tribally affiliated organizations with the Western scientists to work on things like co-production, knowledge creation, bringing values and culture and heritage into the conversation in many different ways. And that's one example of how folks come together. This is another example. So this picture is from an exhibit, Knowledge is Power, which was put together by two partnering tribes. And so in the center is Chantal Camardel. She is the tribal secretary for Jean Charles Nation. To her left is Dennis Davis and his wife, Gwen Davis, and they are with the village of Shishmaref in Alaska. There are long-standing collaborations between Alaska and Louisiana. You'd be amazed at how similar the issues are. And this was a representational sovereignty exhibit, which is not something that everybody thinks about as being part of resilience, but it's tremendously important. And so this exhibit, which you can view part of it online, I just want to read you one quote from this exhibit. These are all pictures that were taken either by Chantel or Dennis, and they wrote the captions. They live in spaces that are often portrayed as zones of disaster. They're portrayed as, the end of the world, and typically the captions are very bleak. And they felt that it was very important to get away from that. And so Chantel wrote, beauty is often described by looking at the physical appearance of a person or thing. To judge a community by its appearance can be misleading when not using the lens of Indigenous people. The human eye sees a reflection of light. The Indigenous heart sees the soul of the Creator. These two island communities are chewed up by water, tattered versions of themselves, but their beauty lies far between. And one piece of resilience is also psychological resilience, right? It's also being able to point to your place, to your home as something that is thriving, that is alive. It's another example of a network, the Land to Sea Network, linking folks that are looking at land rematriation, land trusts, and other methods to, again, protect culture, heritage, and lifeways, not just for Indigenous communities, but really starting from a framing of beginning from the land. And then finally, I know I'm getting close to the end here. I wanted to talk briefly about some ways to engage. One thing I wanted to point to is this notion of governance. This is from the 5th National Climate Assessment, and governance can really be understood as being the complex interactions of multiple social systems. And so if you think about any particular policy issue, you could look at the laws and regulations, but you could also look at public processes, civil society actors, which includes protest. You could look at social norms and the role that they play. You could look at budgeting and where money is going, right? The role of institutions. And when you think about engaging, think about these different spots, because different sites of engagement might be more appropriate for you, right? For you and your organization. And then just quickly a little bit about sort of merging planning with planning. Very often, this relationship is seen as one sort of as the basis for the other, or even one at the expense of the other, or they both ignore each other, right? And so really thinking about merging requires thinking about two-way communication. It requires the local community to be able to engage from a place of strength, not just as a source of data, not just as a picture to go on the plan that shows that there was engagement. And the benefits do go in both directions, right? Larger policy and planning documents do drive where resources go. They drive what's protected and how. They drive who's at the table for larger decisions. And so really being able to maximize those benefits is very important. But there are also a lot of challenges, right? It's simply not possible, feasible, or even sort of rational to engage in everything. I mentioned the FPCC. They get nonstop phone calls to be part of different efforts, right? To come to the table. And that means long drives, time away from subsistence, time away from traditions, to then maybe not even be heard and just be a footnote in meeting minutes. So really thinking about whether there is an ability to influence, what are the costs of participation, and sometimes whether it makes more sense to do your own thing, which is what the First Peoples Conservation Council is doing with the People's Vision for the Coast. Finally, policy, legislation, and regulation. Now, there are ways to engage. Right now, it's a fire hose, and it's a little difficult to really know how best to plug in. But there is a lot that happens locally as well, and you can often lean on partners to help you sort of stay informed about different processes. And sometimes partners can elevate concerns for you. The idea of sort of grass tops organizations can be very helpful. But again, keeping in mind trade-offs, administrative burdens, mission creep, right, being co-opted that are always very present. And with that, I'll stop.
Thank you so much, Alessandra. That was wonderful. I always feel like 15 minutes is a good amount of time, and then it just seems so short, you know? But we will have time to continue this conversation after Dan. So Dan, our final speaker today, Dan Hackborn, he, him pronouns, is a library worker and PhD candidate from Treaty 6, Alberta. His primary focus is an inquiry into options for orienting librarianship towards just and transformative climate action. He is a standing member of the Climate Action Committees for the Canadian Federation of Library Associations and the British Columbia Library Association. Dan, let me pin you, spotlight you. All right, take it away.
Thank you. So I'm going to share a little bit from a public library perspective and maybe loop in some broader knowledge work if I can. In keeping with the workshop theme and as a matter of contextualizing that public library perspective, let me start with where I think about libraries from, which is what Jennifer just mentioned. That is right here, Treaty 6, Amesquatchie-Waskagan, Edmonton on the Niis-Saskatchewan-Ossipee. It's the rightful ancestral home of the Amesquitcho-Winniwak, Papas-Chase and Beaver Hills Cree, as well as the Dene and Niitsitapi Blackfoot Confederacy, among other nations. So this is a petro-economy kind of embedded in the continental plains, and I'm hoping to give you a bit of a tour of it using this tool that I developed. I worked in a public library makerspace there while doing my MLIS, and my thesis research was a review of the intersections between librarianship and climate action focused on this place. In my own personal experience and in subsequent research that I've been a part of, there's a fairly common starting point for climate action that comes up when we get down to the level of local libraries and local library workers, and that is the lack of one, actually. Here you can see kind of a preview of an upcoming survey, and when it came to the most commonly cited barriers to action for Canadian library workers, you can see that financial obstacles, which I kind of expected to be top, barely edged out a lack of expertise and came in well behind conflicting priorities and then not knowing where to start. And this makes sense, I think. Changing planetary climate is inherently overwhelming. And so being overwhelmed is a perfectly normal and valid state of mind to be in. And that's leaving aside all the other slow and fast disasters that are kind of occurring in our lives right now, right? So when I began, climate policy courses offered the same two broad directions as advocated in y'all's national adaptation strategy, mitigation and adaptation. And it and other calls to action do offer great starting points. I also found myself doing a lot of work personally, professionally, and academically to make the connection a little more clear, even amongst like-minded colleagues. There's a sort of why libraries question oftentimes, which is articulated in the National Action Strategy. Slogans like all hands on deck and every job is a climate job and every little bit helps communicate the urgency and vast nature of the problem very well. But I do think it can be tricky to find your place in those slogans. And I think downloading all the responsibility to individuals is a tactic of climate inaction, but staying motivated without seeing any direct feedback or alignment to your work can make it hard or can be hard, especially when so many conventional solutions are still framed as matters of Western science, technology, and engineering, rather than the responsibility of other disciplines and other places and peoples. And so it's important and helpful, I think, to see that alignment and results that come from our collective and individual work. Otherwise, we will continue to run into sentiments like why libraries, or even if we do everything possible within our library, that won't stop climate change, so why should we bother? During my master's, I was thinking about libraries a lot, as you do, and I kept returning to this definition that I cobbled together based on what I learned from Margaret Law, my first library professor, Dwayne Donald, and I'm a Amesquatchie-Winniwak descended professor of education at my school, and the call that bell hooks issued to practice love or relationship as a verb rather than a noun, something that you do rather than something that is. So with this definition, my intent was also to invite the folks from other cultural knowledge and memory vocations to see themselves at this intersection. And I don't mean to homogenize the work we do, but during human-induced rapid climate changes, we generally see that generalists are successful. Your coyotes, your corvids, your rats, and your ravens, and they end up being the successful species rather than specialist institutions. And so I think in many ways, we ourselves are generalist vocations rather than specialized ones. And so I hope there's some value in here for those of y'all in the broader GLAM sector as well. So from here, this is the framework that I developed to help folks like me, a tool to navigate climate action in our work by connecting mitigation, adaptation, community, and knowledge. And that connects mitigation and adaptation to these two other dimensions that folks more often directly connect to our work. And there's that common understanding there. You're the expert here. You know what community that you serve in your work and your institution. And you know what knowledges it typically accesses and needs. So climate action in librarianship and cultural memory work serves as a relationship or a hub between these four directions. And they give us four general quadrants of critical action: community-based mitigation, community adaptation, knowledge adaptation, and knowledge-based mitigation. A compass to look at where you are and where you want to go, because it's not just thinking about easy wins and needs, it means thinking about where you feel motivated, where you and those you're collaborating with have the most energy and agency, and even can take the most pleasure in actually moving that needle on climate change and ecological action. Even as generalists, we can't do everything, but the flip side of every job is a climate job is that all of these directions are crucial and they all need to be done in some way. So let me share a bit about how Edmonton, Amasquatchie-Waskagan, looked using the map compass. So first we have community-based mitigation, keeping those greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere to make a more livable future for our descendants. And I think it can be the hardest for library workers to see themselves in, since, like I mentioned, proposed solutions are so often technocratic or public policy oriented. So looking at Edmonton's emissions, and I realize that graphic is very small, but it's very typical in terms of you have transportation and you have powering and heating buildings, essentially. And the wrinkle is that it's kind of disempowering if we focus on library facilities, which does commonly come up in library climate action. The city and wider regions' power generation are almost 90% fossil fuels due to the province's coal and gas and economic entanglement with petrochemicals. Even LEED certifications have their limits in these circumstances. So instead, I'm drawn to our emissions per person there, which you can see if you squint, but if you look it up elsewhere, is basically 3 times the world average. And again, rather than downloading all the responsibility and burden for effective climate action onto individual Edmontonians, I'm drawn instead to wonder how libraries might collectively facilitate a high quality of life that consumes less material and energy. In these circumstances, supporting and scaling up a library of things seems kind of to be a natural fit. And we might ask what things, and looking at that emissions profile, a scaled up bike library might offset some of those transportation emissions, like the one offered by Halifax Public Library or Markham Public Library, with the pre-existing geographic distribution of library branches in the city to be a good fit for this model. Or consider the resounding popularity of the seed library pilot while I was there. Garden-based collections like those discussed in the second resiliency workshop offer a whole host of benefits. They bring people together in a nonpartisan way. They serve as a platform to share ecological knowledges like native species or changing precipitation patterns, precise kinds of knowledge that are actually critical for community climate knowledge. Done especially well, a garden space can serve as a way to establish better relationships with Indigenous ecological knowledge keepers and systemically vulnerable community members. Furthermore, turning to community resilience, like Jennifer discussed in the first session and earlier, If intentionally and carefully scaled and normalized, alternative economic distribution models like these are actually one of the 4 pillars of the community resilience model, which leads us to the second quadrant, community adaptation. And Alessandra has already covered this area better than I ever could, but I'll just point out a couple additional things. One, when it came to the most visible climate impacts in Alberta, it's wildfires, smoke waves, and heat waves. And libraries in the region are often already serving as adaptive infrastructure, offering public cooling and climate control centers. Now, I do think there's a conversation to be had about our level of resourcing from parent institutions or municipalities. A prof of mine, Tony Samick, framed it as expectations that feminized care professions like nurses, teachers, social and library workers will make up for the failures of masculinized professions like politicians and executives as they degrade social support networks. But there is this element of this work we are already doing as well. The second thing I want to bring up is the pre-existing distribution of libraries is key to this work. Library branches can and do tailor their services, sometimes to the very level of neighborhoods. And elderly folks, non-English speaking households, single-parent households, these people all experience higher vulnerability to climate impacts like heat waves, and how can we plan our adaptive services at this level? And this role is even beginning to get some recognition and traction outside of the vocation in civil engineering and urban planning. In a survey of Edmontonians, over 65% of respondents flagged a library as a desirable site for a resilience hub. If you've heard of that concept, which was developed in Baltimore as a collaboration between those small P planners that Alessandra was talking about and Christian Baja, a researcher there. So in light of this, Beth Patton conducted a review of course offerings in ALA accredited schools that are part of the iSchool consortium and found that only 10 courses offered around library disaster management out of 65 programs, with over 85% of the schools offering no courses at all. And we need to better prepare the next generation of library workers for this work, frankly. Some of my colleagues in rural areas only found out about the incident command system when they were dealing with an evacuation. So if there's one community climate-related action I encourage you to do right after this presentation, it might be to contact the ALA Office for Accreditation and advocate for library emergency management and crisis informatics to become integrated into the curricular requirements. The next quadrant is basically what Era shared, and that's part of what I mean by knowledge adaptation. It's one of the 3 foundations for successful climate adaptation laid out in my own country, Canada's National Adaptation Strategy. Those climate impacts that you're learning about in order that you're more likely to experience in your community. How do we find ways to make that information as accessible as possible and to be creative about it? Because how do we navigate these tools that Era brought up for those folks that don't know? There's that information asymmetry where certain things are obscured and certain things aren't quite as easily accessible. Beyond this, what other information can we prioritize that will be useful for local community resilience? Hardiness zones, what food grows well, how do you purify water from a rain barrel, how do you repair certain tools or set up microgrids? A plus to this kind of adaptive information is it's often perceived as less political than some of the climate change mitigation stuff, for those of you that are worried about perceptions of non-neutrality and partisanship. One thing I also like about the strategy, the Canada's National Adaptation Strategy, is that it highlights the culture as a fundamental part of human health, well-being, and resilience, which Alessandra also mentioned, because the second concern of knowledge adaptation is actually adapting our knowledge systems. When I first got started, one of the things that kicked off my interest were 2 papers that came out in 2018. And one was this one by Durynathon and the Barfords, who researched the threat climate change posed to internet infrastructures. And the second was actually Era's work with Tara Materzik, Pikalek, and Ben Goldman, which kind of gets at a new regime of the disaster cycle that we're talking about, where international events actually cascade to local levels, and that we can't, within our current knowledge systems, really disentangle those impacts from our local context. And so I do wonder about relocalizing our knowledge systems. Here talked about relying more on these different sources versus the centralized government knowledge infrastructures. In their discussing their paper, Era and Ben actually pointed out that small community archives weren't necessarily covered by it since they didn't have the same institutional visibility. Yet those are the things that contain irreplaceable local histories. They're ones with the most resources and greatest importance for filling in archival and cultural silences and providing counter narratives to the violent supremacist ones that we're currently seeing right now. But they're also often the most at risk. The small community archives that you could support could have other benefits. In her book, Alessandra talks about these kind of undeserving victim narratives that happened to citizens of New Orleans after Katrina. And I do think after a disaster, having an accessible archive where everyday folks can share their stories can be great at documenting counter narrative when those things are imposed upon populaces, but also it can be helpful in folks processing the fact that they have experienced a traumatic event. Moving on really quickly. Sorry, I'm going a little over time. Knowledge mitigation, just really quickly, this should be our bread and butter, yet it is one that I don't think we've experimented too much with. These are a couple examples from my own, from Edmonton, Alberta. You've got politicians and you've got organizations, some of which were founded at local universities that were busy kind of mass producing climate information, disinformation. And in a recent study, it looked at how librarians felt about their role in environmental sustainability, and they expressed high support for providing more information and less enthusiasm for active roles like community advocacy and education. But I guess my provocative, spicy take is that it's not a matter of more information at all. It's actually a matter of being more creative about our relationships. Like, we've known about climate change, we know about climate change. If you look at the bibliography there, we've done so since the mid-19th century. More information is not necessarily the thing here. At present, we have incredible marvels of predictive computing modeling the intricacies of the atmosphere, but it's just telling us in ever more excruciating detail how well and truly screwed we are. So figuring out that kind of ethical relationship, I think, is one huge area where we can start, whether that's between people and their knowledge, whether that's with mutual aid organizations like those that Alessandra highlighted, or with Indigenous nations. Carl Lorenz talks about it in the previous session. Like, there's no silver bullet to climate change, we know that, but relationships are a bedrock for community resilience, and there's not really any shortcut. I know we love shortcuts in libraries, but he talks about building that relationship over 16 years. And like, yeah, you don't like, there's not 5 things that'll solve the climate crisis, 5 things that'll build a good relationship necessarily. Like, yeah. So that's all for me. Thank you very much. Here's some references. They'll be posted later when these are shared. And that's me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dan. I really enjoyed that. I'm really grateful to all of the speakers here today. This has just been a lot of great information. I want to encourage, let me go through sorry, just a little technical wobbling here. Okay, now we're back. I want to encourage you now to, we'll open up this discussion, the question and answer period, to the audience and the panelists. There is the Q&A feature that is at the bottom of your screen. If you click on that, I do see there is some stuff going on in the chat right now. I don't see any questions in the Q&A. But following, I'll pose one to get things started to all of the panelists. And this is following what Dan just concluded with about ethical relationship building. In your training, your experience working with groups, whether you're a public librarian and an academic research librarian, whether you're working with the public or students, or if you're working in the community as a mutual aid society, or working with groups on their archives, or as a professional coming in, which can be very disconcerting for local groups. How do you, and this comes, from like an archivist point of view coming in, or Alessandra, even a professional emergency manager coming in, how do you build that relationship? What are your strategies? What has worked for you? What is it more than just, for me, it's like asking the question, how are you doing today? And then actually listening to the answer, right? Engaging with people. But let's talk about some other ways of building ethical relationships. I want to pick on Alessandra mostly because I know you're coming from a field that is often distrusted. I know you're not government, you're not representing a government entity. You have experience there. So I was wondering if you could address that.
Yeah. Well, and I have at times represented government, so it has sort of been a range. I mean, I would say personally, a big part of my approach and what I sort of counsel students and others on is to really come with humility and to be ready to listen, not to assume that you're needed or useful, but to really be willing to learn. And that's a difficult thing to do, right? So especially the longer you spend in these spaces, the more work you do. I also advise folks to bring their whole selves. We're often in emergency management talking to people when they're at their worst, at their most vulnerable, right? And yet we often sort of come to that from this perspective of, I'm a professional, right? Emotion is discouraged, right? This is very objective. And I see this a lot in climate science as well, this sort of holding up of this false notion of objectivity, when if you talk to anybody, I'm sure this holds true for archivists and others as well, right? If you talk to them long enough, you figure out what passion, what love, what drove them to what they do and where they sit, right? I mean, we are all human beings with some measure of affect and emotion, and pretending that doesn't exist is a little false. But coming in as a consultant, in some cases, I would say that it's very important for me to really be invited, and to be invited not just by the funder or the state, because I think sometimes, especially at that level, there's an assumption that bringing someone in from the outside is the best course of action, and you can walk into a room where you're absolutely the least qualified person to do any of it. So that's very important to me as well, to use those networks to sort of ask around where possible, do some vetting, right? Not just say this is an invitation, but say from whom and who's not being invited if I am.
I'd just like to follow up and really highlight that and that humility aspect. I'll just share a quick example. A library that I know of that shall remain nameless went out and basically invited an elder in residence, began an elder in residence program, and it was not a lesson in they did not do so with humility. They basically went out there and basically asked someone to fit into their organization essentially as a social worker with kind of like a culturally relevant background, and that is not good. They have cycled through several elders in residence, and I think the framing should be that of humility, where instead of saying like, come and be a part of our system, like some of these communities, like all this infrastructure that's kind of like being destroyed and degraded kind of in front of us right now, for those of us who are privileged. Some of these communities, the infrastructure never worked, and they had to come up with alternative solutions. And so they're the experts in this matter. And we should be fitting into and integrating into their knowledges and knowledge systems and expertise, rather than kind of assuming that we can just slot them into ours.
I want to say a little bit about this. I don't know if there are funders on the call, but I will say something to this because it ties into something Alessandra said about one of the downsides of everyone being like, we have to involve more people is that these organizations get asked all the time to like weigh in on things, and that is time and travel for them. I'm working on a project right now with one of my clients where I am going to I'm going to very, very, very remote places as part of this work. And my understanding is that there has been some pushback from some of the funders that were related to this project that were like, well, why do we need to spend the travel and the funding to send people out to these very, very, very remote areas? Why can't you just do that with a Zoom call? Well, one, as I think Dan nodded to, sometimes if you're in really remote areas, the telecoms in some of these places is very unreliable. But second, like the best way to build a relationship is to literally show up in person to wherever this is happening. And so, yes, like it could theoretically, like we have done some of this work like on a Zoom call, maybe about 30% of it, but like the kind of relationships you build, I think in a lot of cultures, it is a real mark of respect to go there and actually be there and be present rather than saying jump on a Zoom call in our time zone, right? So those kinds of things, especially now, I think we are so austerity brained that we're like, oh no, we can't, like pay for a lunch that's out, that's, part like where folks live because we can save money by doing things on Zoom. No, absolutely not. Like food, travel things, those are part of how you build actual relationships. And I know that they totally trigger some people's like, oh, someone's going to complain about the funding for this, but you cannot build connections with different communities unless you prioritize some of those things. And yeah, I think that's all I want to say about that.
That's wonderful. Thank you all for really great perspectives on this. Ethical relationship building does require the time, the humility, and your presence. Dan, you've mentioned this in your writing about our optimization and efficiency world we live in libraries, and the managerialism of our work and how that is the way we operate, but that doesn't happen in the real world. That's in a library structure, in a corporate structure. But ultimately, like, that's not how you approach someone when you want to, think through preservation and risk about their community. And you feel like you have something to contribute to that. You might not. Ultimately, it depends on how they receive you. So, okay, I'll have another question, changing direction a little bit. Okay, let's think about risk exposure and the data that we're talking about. Era, when you talk about climate risk and exposure for your clients, I'm wondering what would be a starting point for organizations or for people here who work for maybe smaller community organizations or even for their library in a way to develop their own risk analysis. So what's a good starting point for people that are interested in developing their own risk analysis?
Yeah, so in addition to using some of the tools that I just showed, one of the things that I would really recommend looking at is what are known as, they go by different names. Dan actually just showed an example of this that was like, I think, what was it, Dan, the Canadian National Action Strategy or National Adaptation Strategy? Yeah. So a lot of jurisdictions have these. They go by all sorts of different names. So where I live in the city of Cincinnati, we have the Cincinnati Climate Action Plan. In the United States currently, if you live in a big city, chances are almost certain that there is a climate action plan. depending on the state you live in, there may or may not be a climate action plan. So I live in a state that at the state government level, it's very hostile to environmental issues. So in Ohio, we do not have a state climate action plan, but all of the major cities in Ohio do. So Cincinnati, Cleveland, and Columbus all have city climate action plans. Those plans are typically a combination of science and policy instruments. So they will say things like, in the city of Cincinnati, we are expecting, by the year 2100, this level of heat risks, right? Or we might have, these kind of precipitation events. So there's that kind of science that is part of these climate action plans. But then there's also policy instruments, right? So it might say, so in the city of Cincinnati climate action plan, because we have a lot of issues with flooding, we have hillsides, there's a huge emphasis right now in the city on developing basically like kind of green wetland garden areas near these areas where often there's combined sewer overflows, because we'd rather have that going into like kind of a rain garden rather than someone's basement. So if you were a small community organization trying to sort of understand how you work in that landscape, I think it's really helpful to look at what in your particular jurisdiction is already happening in terms of climate change science and planning, and then sort of figure out how your organization might fit into it, right? So that would be one of my recommendations, is looking at what at your local, state, provincial, whatever level is happening already, and try to basically borrow that information or figure out how does our organization fit into something that the city is working on.
In addition to those kind of state and municipality-based plans, at the beginning, Jennifer, you mentioned kind of different ways of understanding place and things like that. And one thing that I think AIR has done really well, actually, kind of looking at alternative place-based ways of thinking about place in terms of watersheds. And so there's citizen science groups that will look at your local airshed or watershed. In Edmonton, it's the Capital City Airshed Society. I might have that wrong, but it's an airshed society, citizen science, and these ways of understanding place in ways that make sense via ecoregion or biome versus just letting kind of like state lines, provincial lines, national lines necessarily dictate how we think about where we are, I think is really important too. And these kinds of groups have a lot of knowledge to share about that kind of work.
I would just add one thing to which is that I think a lot of these kinds of plans and efforts still sort of operate in silos, and looking for sort of the boundary spanning efforts, right? Looking for the spaces of collaboration can be a strategy to sort of try to get at what's happening without becoming buried in what counts as sustainability, what counts as hazard mitigation, what counts as adaptation. And some cities and states have done a really great job of sort of pulling that together, and others have not. It's been very territorial and turfy here in the US.
Jennifer, I just thought of something else that I wanted to say about this, if that's okay.
Please
And
go
I
ahead.
think this nods back to something that Dan said, which has been really consistent with my experiences of when what I always tell people is archivists and librarians, our problem is not that we're climate change deniers, right? We are, in general, like 99% of most librarians and archivists I've met are very cognizant of the reality of climate change and how it's impacting us. Where I see some resistance to dealing with this is exactly what Dan pointed to, which is there's just so much stuff already going on. And so thinking about this question of climate change adaptation, this might not be a very satisfying thing to say, but I feel it very strongly. I think sometimes a lot of the best practices we have already I'm just speaking from the archive side of the house, but a lot of the best practices we have for running a well-managed archives are also very good sustainability practices. So for example, ideally, archivists don't accumulate a lot of huge backlogs of material, right? Because we want our users to be able to access that stuff as quickly as possible. Well, you know what really sucks when you have a flood is when it hits your backlog, right? Because then you haven't processed it. You don't totally know what's in there. If it's an insurance situation, maybe you're getting like coverage to restore something that you would have weeded out anyway. And so I want to just emphasize that you don't, when we're talking about climate adaptation planning, even in a very small setting, you don't necessarily need to go out and do like a brand new suite of things. You need to just keep doing all the things you know you're supposed to do and do it also understanding how it benefits you on the climate adaptation frame as well. So I hope that it's a little bit helpful too to just think about how these things help us be more resilient, adaptive, whatever language you want to use, is often consistent with existing practices and best standards.
Yeah, I can echo that in terms of just thinking about exponential growth in our field, reconsidering the way we collect, the way we manage what we keep. It's really important even now, not for austerity measures. It's not about that. It's about why are we doing this now, especially now. Yeah, that theme has come up a lot, I think in this workshop series for sure. And it's in the literature, no doubt, especially with the climate librarianship and, Era, Dan, lots about this too. Something I just wanted to ask Alessandra, again, I'm going to pick on you. Why, like when it comes to like climate adaptation or adaptation and mitigation, thinking about the disaster management cycle as having just collapsed, right? It's still useful in that way that we plan within libraries and archives to just mitigate against a disaster, to plan, to mitigate hazards, to plan ahead, to be prepared to respond, and then wait for the next one, right? So that's just circular. But how in your field is adaptation or an adaptive cycle evolving, or is it even? Are you talking about adaptive cycles instead of a disaster management circle? Like, where's that going from your perspective? If I can pick your brain on it.
So I would say that emergency management is sometimes a field in name only, right? And so there's not always necessarily broad agreement, and there's still a pretty wide split between sort of practitioners and folks who are seen as more academics, or the whole sort of universe of pracademics in between. And some of us sort of cross over into climate more or less than others. So there is in practice still, I think, a very solid adherence to the idea of the cycle. I think it's clean. At least up until now, it's been tied to funding sources and organizational structures at the state and the federal level that reflect it, right? And so it's very difficult to talk about that blending and that collapse and still do the reporting that you have to do, right? At the level of individuals, at the level of folks that are doing research, talking about compounding events, cascading events, I mean, I think it gets more and more clear that we're in everything's happening all at once kind of moment. And to be honest, in the broader study of disasters, we have been this whole time, right? I mean, you really can't separate the impacts of a particular flood, for example, from what was already happening with lack of affordable housing, public health challenges, inability to access healthy foods, right? All of these concerns play in to how the disasters experienced. I'm not sure if the field will fully respond to that or not. In part because I think the field is still heavily dependent, in the US at least, on the sort of professionalization and these job titles that are largely funded by federal money that seems like it might go away.
Yeah, it's a complex issue. And, even, I mean, I guess I was also just sort of referring to like thinking about long term planning, right? That doesn't really fall into the disaster management cycle. And climate change is a long term thing, right? You can project 50, 100 years into the future with these tools that Era showed us. But also it's really hard conceptually for humans to do that in our work. Like, what does that mean? We're so 3 to 5 years out almost, like that's it. So anyway, it's a challenge. I get that. housekeeping now. I would love to introduce Lisa Spiro, who is on the part of the advisory committee. Hi, Lisa. Lisa's going to talk to us about the upcoming climate circles.
Thanks so much. So I'm going to guess that everyone in this audience has been really stimulated by this conversation, and we have an opportunity for you to continue the conversation in our climate circle, which will be taking place coming up on March 21st at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, and maybe someone can put the link in the chat. This is an informal opportunity to ask questions, exchange ideas, and connect with other folks who are concerned about these issues. So we hope that you will join us in kind of processing everything that we've heard today and thinking through how we might take action in some way. So I hope to see you in a few weeks. And Justin Wadlin, my co-facilitator for the DLF Climate Justice Working Group, will be working with me to help lead that session as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Lisa. Justin just dropped in the chat the link to register for that climate circle. So if there's more concerns you have, just the overwhelmingness of this all, that's a good place to begin to talk to your fellow, this cohort, make your connections. If you have a desire for a regional group to form around this support group, that is a good place to start as well. So we're closing out. We have about 4 minutes left. I just wanted to leave it open now for any final thoughts from the panelists, from the audience. I want to put you on the spot.
Jennifer, if there are no audience questions, because I don't want to override anything, I do want to just share, and I don't think I have a way to put something in the webinar chat to everyone, so maybe I can put this on the shared notes. But Dan was talking at the end of his presentation about librarians kind of can get locked in the we just need to provide more information mode. And I've talked about this a little bit before, and there's a great quote from Naomi Oreskes, who is a very well-respected kind of climate change historian, if you will. She's looked at the history of science and has done a lot of things. She's the one who did a lot of the research on how oil and gas companies have kind of borrowed the big tobacco playbook. But she has a great quote. Here, let me just find it real quick. It's a cliche to say that knowledge is power. It's not true, actually. Knowledge is knowledge. In our society, knowledge resides in one place, and for the most part, power resides somewhere else. And that disconnect is the crux of the challenge we face right now. And I have found that to be a really powerful quote that I refer to a lot because, yes, like we need knowledge, and also we have to think about how we shift the balances of power as part of this conversation.
I really appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah, there's the shifting in perspective and approaches to problem solving is really, I can't emphasize that enough, really huge. In the world we are living in today. That's the way I see it, that's really hard, right? Like Alessandra was talking about, you can't just like drop the disaster management cycle. Dan, we can't just stop becoming managers in our work. We can't just walk away from optimization and efficiency performance goals that we have while we're working. And it's just, there's trying to shift into knowledges, plural, it's even a hard task, but we're talking about it. That's the first step, so that's great. All right, well, I really want to thank everybody for joining us today. This has been such a long time coming. I've been dreaming of this moment for a year, and I'm so glad to have everyone here at this time. I thank you for your participation, to all of the participants, panelists as well, and everyone who came today, took the time to spend with us. The recordings will be available on the website. Thank you all. That's all. I see all the chats. Thank you very much. Yes, it was great to have you. Thank you. Good. Excellent. Wonderful. Thank you.